It was George Soros who has said that he wants the School of Public Policy to be a new kind of global institution dealing with global problems. And our four prominent faculty and panelists this evening all very much embody the spirit. Indeed, I think it's hard to find the amount of experience, knowledge, expertise, commitment, and, dare I say, passion assembled in the single panel that we are fortunate to have here tonight at the Central European University. Let me introduce them briefly. There is, of course, George Soros himself, founder of Central European University, and in many ways the guardian and mentor whose ideas have carried the School of Public Policy right from its beginning, and whose efforts to promote better governance across a wide variety of public policy issues has been indefatigable. His interest, dedication, and support of organizations such as Publish What You Pay, the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, Global Witness, the Natural Resource Charter, and the Revenue Watch Institute has been pioneering and set in motion, if you will, a global movement devoted to realizing the net gains from resource extraction around the world. And this evening he is joined by three scholars and policy mandarins who have changed the way people think about the resource curse. First of all, Sir Paul Collier of Oxford University, an academic and public intellectual on resource governance and macroeconomic management. Paul is also a prolific author. As you know, his Bottom Billion won numerous prizes, and his book On the Plundered Planet offered concrete suggestions on how to fix the global policy problems that result from improper exploitation of natural resources. This is the second time that we welcome Paul as a panelist to an SPP event this year, and we are, of course, very privileged to count Paul as one of our distinguished visiting professors at the School of Public Policy. Professor Robert Conrad from Duke University is a global authority on the economics of tax policy and mineral taxation. He has advised and assisted governments, private entities, and international organizations for over 30 years on natural resource policy. And last but by no means least, we have Danny Kaufmann with us, who you remember as a moderator from Monday's panel. Danny has pioneered innovative approaches to measure governance and corruption, both as a former colleague at the Brookings Institution and as a director of the World Bank Institute. And he currently is president of the Revenue Watch Institute and the Natural Resource Charter, which, as many of you know, have recently merged, working on governance challenges in natural resources. And he will again serve as a provocateur for this evening's panel. Let me finally welcome our 50 participants of our 2-week intensive professional development course we are organizing with RWI and the Natural Resource Charter. They work for a wide variety of organizations, governments, national oil companies, universities, international NGOs, local civil society. They're here in Budapest to share their own experiences, learn from each other, and I'm sure and I hope we very much have the opportunity to hear from them later in the discussion. And with this, it's my pleasure to hand over the floor to Danny. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Good afternoon, good morning in other parts of the world. It is my pleasure to be with you again today, since I have not been labeled as moderator because I'm not very moderate, but as a provocateur. Let me take the liberty of saying something more personal to complement the great remarks by Wolfgang about each one here. And that is, if we rewind almost 22 years, it's 1992, the Iron Curtain has just fallen. The Soviet Union is no longer, and instead many new countries are born. I'm in Kiev, Ukraine, having just been asked to open the whole program and office for Ukraine by the World Bank, where I was working then. It's the first few days I'm working. There are a few chairs I have and two young, great recruits that have come to work with me, and one of them says The man outside of the door insists in talking to you. I said, fine, what's his name? His name is Mr. George Soros. So that's when we meet. And of course, George had come to Ukraine and starts an immensely important program in the context of his Open Society initiative. And we started a relationship that dates back to then. And already at that time, he was very immersed in thinking about all these issues related to governance that are before us today. Only a couple of years later, this very similar thing happens with Bob Conrad. So on the left, when George Soros hears about his great expertise in public finance and taxation, he's in Moscow, and George calls him to please help Ukraine in that context. Only a few years later, I'm already back at the World Bank in Washington, and Mr. Soros visits with me very kindly, and we had a great conversation and discussion about current challenges in governance and corruption where we were working on. And then he says, well, sorry, I have to move on now because I'm going to meet now this man who wrote this fantastic paper about conflict and economic development. His name is Paul Collier. And then he just walked across the street in the same organization where Paul was, and there you went. So it's something that binds us all together. But one glue, obviously, is, from a very historical perspective, is what George has done, including in the field of natural resource governance, where he became interested already many years ago. So perhaps first, to get this started, I will start with a very general question to George in terms of your historical reflection, in terms of the movement that George basically was a leader and a pioneer in creating this movement of natural resource governance. Like we did it on Monday, this will be very open and interactive. George Soros will lead it off with these general reflections, and then we'll go to the other great eminent panelists we have here. We'll have a bit of back and forth like we had it then, and then we will open it to the public here, and if questions come through Twitter or email, we'll try to take them as well in that very interactive, frank type of discussion as we have had it throughout, in fact, the course already. So without further ado, in terms of your reflections, but also since we all know that you don't mince any words and you're very frank, not only that historical perspective, not only in the historical perspective, what do you think are the main, not only achievements of the movement, but the challenges now and ahead in terms of natural resource governance, which is the topic today?
Good. Well, basically, responsive. And so we exploited that and got them to actually publish what they pay. But the idea was really what I call a fertile fallacy, because you couldn't get everybody that was making payments to join, because there are a lot of fly-by-night oil companies, mining companies that don't depend on the public, and the oil is fungible, so they were under no pressure to join. And there were national oil companies that don't have to publish their figures anyhow, so they were not susceptible. Fortunately, and at the time, actually, I went around and talked to the various major stock exchanges to ask them whether you could actually compel all other companies, oil companies and mining companies, to disclose the payments they were making to governments. And they said, no way. It was a successful launch, but it couldn't actually achieve the purpose for which it was designed. Fortunately, the Blair government in England, which was to some extent very close to the international NGOs like Save the Children and Oxfam and so on, they responded, and they set up the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, EITI, and that's not such a catchy name as the other one, and as Bono would say, you can't make it rhyme. But still, there it is, EITI, and that was a combination of governments, companies, and civil societies, NGOs or civil society organizations that would work together on a voluntary basis, and that the whole thing took off, and it really grew tremendously. Now, it was adopted by the international financial institutions, and they made their loans and grants conditional on the countries complying or joining EITI. And that was the most important driving force in making it work. Now, now you have actually a spoiler, and that's China, because China became very active in looking for sources of natural resources, particularly oil, and they were willing to come in and make investments, no questions asked. So we were, for instance, very close to making a deal with Angola, which is a country where a lot of money disappears in the hands of the government, as it was exposed by Global Witness. They were about to make some moves to be more transparent, but then China came along and gave them a loan of $2 billion, and that was that. Now, of course, Angola is raking in the money. They don't need any, and they themselves became rather spoilers in the rest of Africa. When you look at what happened in the Congo, Angola was one of the main spoilers and sources of corruption in the Congo. getting China on board is, I think, one of the most important things for moving forward from here. And I think there's a reasonable chance of actually getting them involved because there was once a closed door, so confidential meeting with the mining companies where they explained to me that they are all in favor of eliminating corruption, except when it comes to getting the exploration license. Because unless you have a license, you have, there are no holds barred there. Because unless you have a license, you have no interest. So your interest is to get a license, and you'll do whatever you can to get it. So they explained to me, once we got the license, we are ready to cooperate. So by now, the Chinese got the licenses. They had to move in where others feared to tread. They had to go to, South Sudan and Zimbabwe and the Congo and so on. But now they are there, so I think that their interests are compatible to some extent. Not entirely, because they are not terribly supportive of civil society at home. So why should they be tolerant of them abroad? And I think the argument has to be that it's not a matter of supporting civil society, but establishing certain standards, international standards. So I think there's a chance of doing it, but it hasn't been done. And that, I think, is one of the major tasks if we want to maintain the really remarkable momentum that we have gained. Now, secondly, in my opinion, EITI itself is kind of possibly dispensable. This is rather a radical view. I'm not actually saying this terribly publicly, but this is public enough because what has happened after the financial crisis of 2008, the collapse of the financial markets and legislation, Dodd-Frank Act in the US contained a clause actually requiring any company listed on New York Stock Exchange, subject to the Securities and Exchange Commission, to publish what you pay. So what was voluntary became obligatory. And that changed the, let's say, the interest or the calculations, or particularly of the major oil companies. And they objected to this legislation, challenged it in court, and actually succeeded in winning most of their on most of their objections. So that looked like a big setback. But fortunately, in the meantime, the Publish What You Pay movement and Bono supporting an organization called One, and Bono was very active also, and Global Witness, actually got the European Union to adopt the same legislation. So it's now became law in the EU, which applies to London, and that's just as important as New York. And Canada is coming on board, and Australia. So it looks like it's this compulsory aspect is here to stay. But the attitude of the oil companies is now, let's say, much more questionable. They are still members, but much less supportive than they have been, and it would be really important to get China in. So if one could get China in, then it would be, one could go back to basics and let them be part of creating a new up-to-date organization, so they are there at the creation and they can then be full members. As it is now, they see it as a colonial creation. It's, you know, the previous colonial powers that have now recognized their past sins and want to atone for it. Now, of course, they are in a way, the Chinese are in the way of committing exactly the same sins as the colonial powers did, but they are not aware of it, or it doesn't seem to bother them too much. So this is the other, let's say, challenge, how to have a structure which recognizes the role of civil society, because it's very important to have monitors and people who hold governments accountable involved. So that's the second challenge. And the third challenge actually is to, let's say, create a proper architecture for the movement, because people joined or organizations joined, and how do they work together? It's a network. And to make a network work is not so easy. And that needs to be worked out as well. You need proper coordination, consultation. It's functioning quite well right now, but I think it needs some improvement in the architecture. One very important development that just is occurring right now is that the Revenue Watch Institute and the National Resource Charter, which have always been very close, but they're two separate organizations, are merging into one under the name of energy. A natural resource governance institute, which is again not a terribly easy, but if you put them together, NRGI, it's energy and it's one word. So that's your invention, so I give you credit for it. So that's my answer. I would say these are three key tasks which I think need to be resolved to maintain the dynamism, which is, when you think of it, of where we were in 2002 and where we are today, where, for instance, in the last G8 meeting under Britain, under Cameron's Britain, and with the Cameron happened to delegate the task of designing the substance of the program for that meeting to Paul Collier. So as a result, these issues of transparency were rather prominent in the G8 meeting, and they are now, carried on by under G20. So it's really it's become a core issue of international governance. So maybe you have some observations on that.
Let me pick up on that, and we'll turn to Paul. Yes, they are picked up by the G20, as you said, and maybe in the near future by the G7 again, but that's another matter. Sometimes it's really hard to play the role of lead provocateur, but when we have George Soros here, in terms of radical ideas and provocation, I don't have to do much, and already two great things, among others, stand out. One is all these issues, the significant debate we have had in the course already about EITI, and there's a lot of interest. Some of us would still be optimistic enough to say that it can be improved, and in fact it should be improved, and that there are a lot of achievements, so let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Hopefully from the discussion and going further, we should go deeper into that, including on what you mentioned, the importance of the role of civil society, embracing countries and trying to attract countries like China, even though they're very challenged in terms of civil society and so on. So those are pending challenges. Also, I've been working on governance and anti-corruption for decades, and I always learn from you, Mr. Soros, the whole notion of the China exception that, yes, anti-corruption, except for licenses, should be discussed further. Already you mentioned that an absolutely crucial contribution to the whole field, the leading contribution intellectually, natural resource governance was made already years ago by Paul in his Bottom Billion book, where he planted the seed, in fact, for the Natural Resource Charter as an intellectual framework. Then it becomes a reality and organization, and now we are in this together. So let me turn to Paul. First, you may have reflections on what was already said, but also given your incredibly incisive focus on eventually having better policies at the country level, led by the country, that ultimately will unlock the potential for the country of harnessing the natural resources. You have also weighed into the very difficult issue of how a country and a leadership manages expectations, and particularly given the ages of major discoveries in Africa, and now they're beginning to come on stream. I know that that's a very big issue. But first, you may have reflections already what was said, and go ahead on that specific question too.
Thank you. So let me first pick up on Mr. Soros' points about EITI and G8 and G20. I think there's actually a very healthy interaction between voluntarism and compulsion. And there's nothing unusual about that combination in natural resources. It works on loads of different issues. Think of the movement away from smoking over the last 50 years. That's been a combination of voluntarism and compulsion. So I think they're a healthy combination where you can push the frontier with voluntarism, and then there's a time when you built up enough consensus that compulsion comes behind. Now, I think you're quite right that China it's absolutely vital that China becomes an active part of this. I also think it's very timely. I was in China in November, just after the plenum, and the Chinese they wanted to talk to me about resource extraction in Africa, and the problems it was generating, they were well aware that it was building risks that China didn't have an appetite for, because China has a very strong sense of order and a very strong sense of the long term. And so building long-term disorder is not something they're keen on. It's also very clear they're not going to sign up to EITI or sign up to anything else that is already there. During the G8, 5 of the G8 countries signed up to the EITI, which was massive. And so it has, in a sense, become the new global standard. But it's not going to be the global standard that China accepts. The passage from G8 to G20 is actually very important, because G20 is now the right group for global action, and G20 includes China. And so getting the G20, without G8 action, you wouldn't have got the G20 to consider it. But having moved, with the G8 having put its own house in order, now it's possible that the G20 will say, yes, this matters, we're going to step up to it, and we're going to sort it out properly. So that's, I think, the big hope. Meanwhile, there's still a role for voluntarism to move the frontier. And I think that's an exciting development, potentially within ITI, that the transparency of revenues is a vital place to start. Without the transparency of revenues, you have lost, with no question. But it's not the place to stop.
Yeah, but for that, EITI ought to be pushing the limits, and it's not doing it, because it's eager, has been eager to get countries to join, and in that process, they have really abandoned the standards that they are supposed to impose. They were very successful in the sense that there are now, I think, 40, how many countries? 44 countries are now sort of signed up. But I think it should be time, if EITI is going to be at the cutting edge, they ought to impose the standards that they demand, and they are not doing it.
I agree with that.
The trouble with international organizations generally is that they are all eager to acquire new members, but very reluctant to spend any, or this is the problem with the human rights effort of the UN, because it's an association of states, and they don't like to be censored or censor others, because it means that they could be censored. So human rights organization, it's the human rights violators that are judging the others, and they're usually giving them a free pass. And the same thing, in a way, is happening now to EITI. So if it is to retain its usefulness, it's got to re-establish its commitment to maintaining international standards.
Now let me move on to the question that Danny asked me about expectations. And here, I should say, unlike you two, I'm temperamentally not inclined to be to provoke, as it were. But I seem to be able to blunder into it nevertheless. And so I suspect I'm going to blunder into it now, because I'm going to suggest that for the last 20 years, we've been fighting one hugely important battle, and we're winning it pretty decisively. But that is not the only battle. It's time to start a new battlefront, and it's quite a different battle. So the battle to date has been built on the assumption that the core of the problem is government, and that the solution is empower citizens to scrutinize government. Government needs to be accountable to citizens. That's been the core thrust of the last 20 years, and it's obviously sensible. And now, and we're obviously winning it. And now what I want to argue is that that isn't enough, and that government accountable to citizens may end up getting us from the frying pan into the fire, from the frying pan of greedy government officials into the fire of foolish people. And so there's a new, as we win the accountability battle, holding governments accountable to citizens, it becomes more important to fight that second battle, which is building citizen understanding. And here's the nub of the problem, that development from natural resources is not easy. It requires some rather difficult decisions to be taken and implemented, some politically difficult things. And there's a danger of populism in which foolish citizens, having achieved accountability of government to citizens, then drive governments into foolish policies. And so, yes, we need governments accountable to citizens. Without that, we're dead in the water. But citizens are not off the hook. They have to make the effort to understand the policies that are really important for this rather distinctive challenge of harnessing natural resources for development. So, finally, to come to Danny's question, which you've now all forgotten, Danny's question was about expectations, managing expectations. And this is an example, it's not the only example, but it's an example of where citizens can drive governments into folly. If we go back to Nigeria when it discovered oil, the big impact in Nigeria was not the discovery of oil, but it was the hike in oil prices in 1974. So overnight, Nigeria went from being a poor country to a potentially quite well-off country. So basically, it was late 1974, the big hike in oil prices. And what did the government do the very next year? It raised public sector wages by 75% overnight. And things called the Adoji Pay Awards. And so that was populism in action. That massive increase in expectations on the part of ordinary people, and then the government just conceding to that, you're all rich. And that gesture, you're all rich, really denies the opportunities of harnessing resource wealth for development. Because if you want to actually sustainably develop, you're not suddenly all rich. You've got a long slog of converting natural wealth into sustained productive wealth, basically investment. In my own country, Britain discovered oil in 1966. I remember a cartoon in a magazine called Punch, two tramps sitting on a hillside. An imagined scenario about 30 years later. And one tramp was saying to the other, and then we discovered oil, and there didn't seem to be much point in working anymore. And then we roll on to Kenya in 2012. They discover oil. And at the time, They don't know whether it's a commercial discovery, and if it is a commercial discovery, it'll be years before it comes out of the ground. March 2012, and I saw the finance minister of Kenya the next month, and I said, how are things? And I thought he'd be a happy man. And he looked really depressed, and he said, it's terrible. He said, the public sector unions have just put in a massive pay award. And straight from discovery of oil to we're all rich. We don't need to work anymore. Tanzania, gas. And I talked gas offshore of a region called Mtwara. I talked to the commissioner for Mtwara region. He said the youth of Mtwara are saying, we're rich, we don't need to work anymore. Literally that phrase. And I want to contrast that with Africa's natural resource success story, which is Botswana. And in Botswana, the first president, Soros, a great man, and one of the things he did was develop a narrative of patience. And the way he developed a narrative of patience was just to repeat all around the country, every Botswanan knows this, we're poor and therefore we have to carry a heavy load. And if you think about it, that simple phrase, we're poor and therefore we have to carry a heavy load, it's the antithesis of we're rich, we don't have to work anymore. And so Botswana used its diamonds gradually to build the country. And it's now got highest per capita income in sub-Saharan Africa, the same as Mauritius. Right? But it's that narrative of patience. Soros managed expectations. The leadership of Nigeria in the 1970s failed to manage expectations. Thanks.
Great. You were right. You wade right into provocation too, and I'm sure there'll be questions and discussion on this, and particularly on this notion that the next big challenge is informed citizens, and we need to move the pendulum perhaps a bit away from saying that the problem is with government. Still, the issue of informed government, informed technocrats is crucial, and that's why we will lead to my question also to Bob, because this is what you do very, very often. And there's a real question there, since you, Paul, raised it, about the importance of narratives, but at the end of the day, this is also a very complex field, and many of you from government, from parliament, from civil society, and all stakeholders are here, and it's a very intricate course, 2 weeks, and there are many others because of the technical issues. So devil in the details matters a lot in this area too. So how to manage that, I'll get into that in 1 second, but I didn't want to leave this very important issue of EITI that has come up, because also that illustrates the importance of devil in the detail. And I'd like to at least note, complementing what you said, Paul, that there is a complementarity sometimes between the voluntary and the mandatory in terms of listing requirements for disclosure by companies, is the fact that, A, we are far from being done on the mandatory, because this is still being litigated very, very hard by the American Petroleum Institute, the big oil lobby. So we are not there yet in the mandatory. So other forms of making progress are crucial, which is your complementary point. But also, each one has its role. The mandatory listing requirement, whether EU or the US, focuses only on revenue payments by our companies. It does not touch on contracts, which EITI is getting into now, beneficiary ownership, state-owned enterprises, which is crucial. So there is a complementary role in terms of getting into other issues as well. But last and not least is an issue of stakeholder too. The focus on the mandatory is on corporations and private sector corporations, which are listed, while EITI is on government. So that gets us to where is the balance. But again, it's the importance of balancing it and complementing it between both. Now to the question to Bob, because you are so much on the on the technocratic public policy and advisory sphere. So on this issue of keeping the government officials engaged in the process, as well as the public, because it does require addressing very complex technical issues. But again, Paul's point that the simple narratives are crucial. How do you, in your experience, how do you manage that trade-off? How do you manage that balancing between both, between the very technical, being such an eminent academic and so on the one hand, and then when does the narrative come particularly, it becomes particularly useful, but maybe that's not enough when it comes to the whole tax policy or public finance approach and fiscal regimes into play.
As Paul said, the public has got to be involved in some very tough decisions on how to raise the money and how to spend the money. But as a technician, and I will be the first to admit that I am a technician, those decisions are also complex. And so the challenge for me as a technician, the challenge for all of us in trying to create a dialogue is to try to figure out a way of making these, what initially appear to be very complex decisions, converted into not only language, but into numerical examples and ways that can promote understanding. So let me just give you an example, okay? Your country doesn't own some reserves. You own the reserves. Somebody comes to me as the owner of the reserves and says, I have got a deal for you, okay? And here's the deal. We're going to give you a carried interest. We're going to engage in exploration, but we're going to compound these exploration expenses at LIBOR plus 8. And then if we find something, we're going to have development expenses, and we're going to compound those development expenses at LIBOR plus 6. And then we're going to use standard internationally accepted accounting principles to compute cash flow. And we're going to apply a 14% discount rate, and when the net present value of this project gets to be positive, you will get a payment, okay? Great deal. Now, let me tell you my reaction as a technician, okay? And I have to, you know now that I have spoken that I am a Southerner, so I have to remember what my mother taught me about being nice. And I begin my response by saying, Madam or Sir, you have got to be out of your mind. I have no idea what you're talking about. Until you can explain this to me in a way that I can understand, and you can tell me, show me via numerical examples what happens under different types of situations, I'm not signing this deal, because if I sign this deal and don't understand it, it's my problem. I've got to be able to understand exactly as much as I can, okay, given the uncertainties of the world. I've got to be able to understand what these terms mean, how they apply, how they are going to affect the risks that are shared between us. And I have got to ask, ultimately, the bottom line question, at the end of the day, what's in it for me? What amount of money comes in? What amount of money comes out? At the end of the day, the questions become very simple. You know, who gets the money and when? And so Complexity, yes. I am once again a technician, and I have a vague idea of some of the terms that I just spewed out. Okay, but until we have a dialogue, and until civil society and the governments engage in a dialogue, and to be frank, not be afraid to ask dumb questions, because as an economist, I can only speak for myself as an economist, but economists are extremely simple-minded people. And you've got to explain it to me in a way, in a framework that I can understand. And the benefit, it seems to me, of being able to have public dialogue, to have conversation about what these terms mean, and even in the context of EITI, with all its limitation, you can begin to find solutions and a common language that the population can begin to understand and take responsibility for their own understanding of what can be immensely complex contractual relationships. But again, it seems to me that the benefit of transparency is that there is the ability of people to stand up and say, I don't have any idea what you're saying. You've got to explain this to me. We need to have a deal that we can understand. And so the challenge, I think, is on both my part as the technician, but also on your part, to say we've got to become engaged in making a bit of an investment to actually to begin to discuss exactly what these things mean, which means making a bit of investment in the dialogue itself, but also means you get over this defensiveness about saying, I don't understand this. I don't understand this. And so I'm not going to say anything because somebody is going to think I'm dumb. Okay. Fortunately for me, being 66, I no longer have that problem. Okay. I no longer have that problem. And I think that the lesson of complexity is to be able to begin to have that type of discussion.
Oh, that's great. And in fact, having been here with you for a number of days already, it's quite clear that there is an enormous amount of sophisticated understanding by so many of you, and have a lot to tell us when we say that we don't know what the reality is, particularly sometimes on the ground, what's really happening. So perhaps this is a perfect segue to go to you now, and I'm sure that many will want to ask questions. I'm going to ask, for the sake of time, that they're brief, whether a comment or a question, and then we'll be coming back to the panel to make it truly participatory. Who wants to go first? You get. And please introduce. Oh, that's Charles, who is it's only 2 days ago. So.
I'm Charles Wango from the Kenya Civil Society platform on oil and gas. I just have a quick question for Paul. Paul sort of mentioned the feeling that communities have, especially after natural resources, this idea that they're rich, for example. But I was just wondering, doesn't he see that as a positive thing as well, in a sense that because communities feel the ownership of these resources, they're not willing to let them go. Having worked in corruption for a long time, one of the issues has been to get people to understand that taxes or tax money is actually their money.
Go ahead. In the meantime,
Okay.
then
Yeah. Yes, but there are I think there are three battles that have to be fought on citizen understanding. One is about expectations, which is really about a sense of realism. Liberia recently got $50 million from Exxon for the rights to prospect. And when that hits the news in Liberia, $50 million sounds like a lot of money. But actually, per Liberian, it's $12. So just getting a sense of realism. With $12 per head, you're not going to transform life, right? Whereas 50 million is a sort of mesmerizing number. So just communicating in a way that gives a sense of realism of what's possible. The second issue is indeed on community ownership. And this is a really important issue for societies to discuss and for governments to lead a discussion on before resources are discovered. Tanzania recently discovered gas. And President Nyerere, the founding president of Tanzania, had, when he first became president, he actually stood down for a year because he said, I've not inherited a country, I've inherited 150 tribes. And so he then spent a year going round Tanzanian society, basically saying, you're all Tanzanians now, right? And then he adopted a lot of policies to make people feel Tanzanian, first and foremost, right? So you roll on to 2012, and the Tanzanian government has decided to prospect for offshore gas. So I'm brought in to talk to them, and I say, well, have you ironed out who actually will own this gas? That is to say, what's the balance between owning it nationally and owning it in the locality where it's found? And the Tanzanian cabinet said, oh, it's not an issue in Tanzania. Everybody knows it's Tanzania and it's offshore, right? Anyway, so it's not even going to be on any Tanzanian land. But roll on 4 months, and it was discovered offshore of a region called Mtwara. 4 months later, there were riots in Mtwara because what the Mtwarans started saying was, it's Mtwaran gas. This isn't Tanzanian gas, this is Mtwaran gas. 4 people dead in riots because people were so angry that they felt Mtwaran gas was being stolen by Dar es Salaam or whatever, right? Now, different societies come up with different rules as to who natural resources belong to. Right? In Canada, the natural resources belong to the region, not the nation. In America, they belong to whoever happens to be sitting on top of the land. Nobody else is that silly, but the really important thing is to settle this before you find things. John Rawls, the great philosopher, came up with the concept of a veil of ignorance, right? And behind the veil of ignorance, that's the time to establish the rules of justice. Now, until you discover things, you've got a natural geological veil of ignorance. You don't know what there is. Right? So Seretse Khama, he's back again, the first president of Botswana. Before Botswana went big into prospecting for diamonds, he went round the country with the following message. He said, we're dirt poor. Botswana was the poorest country in Africa. We are dirt poor. We have nothing. So can we agree that anything we're lucky enough to find belongs to all of us? Behind the veil of geological ignorance, everybody in Botswana agreed to that. And then they found, the trouble with natural resources, you always find them there and not there. They're somewhere, not everywhere. Right? There are always some lucky people, and hence some unlucky. So you need that debate before you discover natural resources. Right? My own country, just to finish this story, Britain, you know, we were a democracy, so we had this discussion. We came up with the rule, oil belongs to everybody. And then you go and look, and guess where they're found? Guess where the oil's found? Scotland. And guess what the Scots are now saying? It's ours, right? You know, that breaches a principle of basically of justice. Right? You can have any rules you like. You can do Canada, you can do America. And in most societies, it's actually sensible to have some balance between ownership at the local level and ownership at the national level. Where people have strong local identity, as in Matwara, it's probably sensible to sort of privilege the local to some degree. Your starting point, that it's a vital matter that people realize this stuff belongs to them, not to some remote government, that is absolutely true. Right? But it is also a vital matter that people resolve this tension as early as possible between the local and the national.
It's half in jest, Paul, but perhaps between your previous comment about informed public and citizen and what you just said about the rosy and veil of ignorance is an internal contradiction, because maybe what's needed in countries that unfortunately already everybody knows where the resources are is to go back to the veil of ignorance and start again. But obviously, this is an intellectual construct. The point is incredibly powerful and important.
I think you need to sort of, as it were, retrofit the veil of ignorance and say there's a principle of justice here.
That's what's so powerful. Let's go.
But just sorry. Why it's such an important issue for poor countries is that most of their natural resources are still undiscovered. Huh? I mean, here's a great statistic that you will, it's the one thing you'll remember from what I've said in a year's time. Yeah? So, we've got a square here, the table. Imagine that is the typical square mile of Africa. Right? And then we've got another table there, and that's the typical square mile of the OECD, the rich world. And we're going to look underneath them. And underneath that square mile of the rich world is $300,000 of natural assets. That's as of the year 2000. What's underneath the square mile of Africa? Could be more, could be less. And to make this fun for me, I'm going to get you to vote on it. Right? So underneath the square mile of the rich world, the OECD, $300,000. What's underneath the square mile of Africa? Anybody who thinks it's less than the rich world, hands up now. Anybody who thinks it's more than the rich world, hands up now. Right? This is why you'll all remember this, because you're all wrong. Right? As of 2000, as of the year 2000, known subsoil assets were only $60,000 in Africa, 300,000. As our chairman so correctly pointed out, that was known subsoil assets. I tried to find the figures for unknown subsoil assets, but I just couldn't find them. Now, what have you learned from that? You've not learned that Africa's got less than the rich world. These are random geological processes. The averages will be much the same. What you've learned is that as of the millennium, Africa had only discovered about a fifth of what it's got. Now, over the last 10 years, it's discovered quite a lot, but there's still a lot of discovery to go. And so you're still behind a lot of that veil of ignorance. And so it's still time to resolve that matter.
Great. Let's move now to George, because I got a number of great questions through Twitter, use of technology, and we moved to a different part of the world, which now has implication worldwide. And the question comes from Dan Wave to George Soros. He or she wants to hear about the so-called geopolitical resource curse, namely the ongoing game between Russia and the West.
Well, We started in Ukraine, we end up in Ukraine. It's a very topical, very topical issue. And of course, it is a geopolitical issue, but it's got to do with gas mainly. Ukraine is halfway between Europe and is between Europe and Russia, and the gas comes not only from Russia, of course, but it comes through Russia, because a lot of the gas is in Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan. But before it gets to Ukraine, it doesn't actually have to go through. And there's now an effort by Azerbaijan to find a path through Turkey, which will actually change the geopolitical situation. But it's gas from Russia which Ukraine converts into basically steel, mainly steel, and sells mainly to Europe. So that's the situation, and then you have a particular conflict which has arisen, which is best understood by understanding the weaknesses of the parties concerned. Putin acted out of weakness, and Europe responded out of weakness. And Ukraine itself, of course, is mired in corruption, so it's also pretty weak. So it's a competition between different weaknesses. I mean, I can go through the whole story. It would take too long. I don't know if you really need to go there, but it's actually a challenge and an opportunity for Europe to respond to the desire of now well established by the rebellion on the Maidan, to be Ukraine wants to be closer to Europe, and will Europe succeed or rise to the occasion and actually take the steps that are necessary to enable Ukraine to achieve its ambition? And if Europe does respond, I think it would really give the European Union a chance to rediscover its own original raison d'être, which it has lost because of the euro crisis. That's roughly where we are.
Well, and it is quite rough in the literal sense, obviously. I'm very pleased, of course, because of my background and work, that you have raised the issue of corruption, because a lot of the analysis tends to focus on these geopolitical issues on the extent of dependency between Ukraine and particularly eastern side on Russia versus the rest. on EU, but in Europe. But let's not underestimate the importance that corruption played in the crisis, as the incredible stories have now emerged, have come out, and were kept under wraps before Yanukovych, the former president of Ukraine, had to flee, in terms of the millions and millions, hundreds of millions that he amassed in an illicit fashion due to the vested interest in the gas sector and the palaces that he built up. So there's a lot of personal vested interest, and let's call it by its name. Corruption, and as Paul has written about, a pillage that was taking place, and those vested personal interests end up having major geopolitical significance related to corruption, which sometimes, because we try to be politically correct, they are not brought up to light with the importance that it deserves.
Kissinger is, of course, the author of this science of geopolitics,
Right.
which regards each country as an entity that's given, and it's always the same. And his theory of geopolitics was kind of shaken when the Soviet Union disintegrated, because there was the Soviet Union, it had a certain geopolitical position, and then there wasn't the Soviet Union anymore. So so what's inside those chess pieces that are moving on the board is as important as what the chess pieces can do as a chess piece, namely that how Russia can move and occupy Crimea, and nobody can stop them. That's the ability of Russia as a chess piece. But what's inside Russia, what is driving Putin, that's his weakness.
Yeah.
Namely, he was very popular, and then when he made that deal with Medvedev, they changed places, the Russian public was really upset about it, and he lost his popularity. Until then, he tolerated civic demonstrations, but then he got scared, and he cracked down. He became repressive at home, and he became very aggressive abroad. That's when he started providing Assad with weapons on a large scale to change the situation in Syria, turned it around. So he was acting out of this weakness, and that's left out of Kissinger's theory. So what's inside, the way I look at the world, what's inside, whether it's an open society or a closed society, what kind of regime it is as important as what its military power is.
I mean, just in support of that, I'd say that what really scared Putin was the thought that what happened in Ukraine, that Orange Revolution, that could happen in Russia. And he diagnosed what had caused the problem in Ukraine was civil society, NGOs. And so what was the technology for solving it? The non-government NGOs. And so what he started setting up was for every NGO, there'd be a non-government NGO.
And that's the perfect segue to the next question that's come from Twitter, but not without commenting that for next great panel, your metaphor of chess should be taken further. Kings, queens, horses, and pawns are in this game. But much more specific now, but related to this point about Putin and civil society, NGOs, and government, A question comes from the executive director of Global Witness, in fact, Gavin Hyman, who asks, and I'll let maybe both of you briefly so that we have more questions from the floor. He asks, what does letting Ethiopia into EITI, what does it do for its credibility given its clamp down on civil society and press freedom? Who wants to take that first?
Tomorrow I fly to Ethiopia for a meeting with the Ethiopian government. So not me. Ask me on Sunday.
Let me say something about Ukraine, which I think is very important.
Then we have to answer Ethiopia too.
But we'll come back to Paul after Sunday. No, but what happened on Maidan, I think, is a tremendously important event that changes the character of Ukraine as a political entity. And I think it should not be underestimated, because here was a group of basically unarmed civilians, with sticks and shields, actually storming a police force that was given orders to use lethal force, so live ammunition, and they used it. And on the morning at dawn on February 20th, the people from Maidan actually attacked, and they had to cross an open field of fire, and they kept going, and they overran the police, and the police ran away, and that was I think it was the birth of a nation, because Ukraine became, which was very much divided between East and West, is more unified, and people having sacrificed their lives for getting rid of the regime that prevailed. They really don't want this revolution to fail the way the Orange Revolution did. And this is a very important local force that should not be underestimated. And I'm afraid that people in Europe don't fully appreciate it. There's tremendous and justified suspicion of, and of course things won't work very differently. And in fact, the politicians that have come forward in this revolution are no different, and in fact they are tainted by the corruption that has prevailed. That hasn't changed, but the willingness of civil society to tolerate that has changed. So it's a very powerful positive force that needs to be reinforced, and if it were reinforced, you would have a genuine change in Ukraine.
Right. But then you yourself have expressed the real concern, both in private sectors but also publicly, about the closing space, contrary to open society, in some other countries, Azerbaijan, for instance. Yeah. And the question just came up about Ethiopia. It's no secret that there is increasing repression on civil society. So what are your thoughts about that, and what can be done in those contexts, and should talking about global architecture, so should these international bodies, international initiatives and organizations still go ahead and have them in their fold, or there should be more conditions? What are your thoughts about those countries where the civil society and voice and space it's closing rather than opening?
No, I mean, that's an ongoing thing. Then you have a revolution, and the revolutions usually fail. I mean, if you look at what happened in Egypt, for instance, where you now have, after revolutions, usually you have restoration. That's the normal sequence. That's the story of Russia, where you had a revolution, and then you have a restoration. The communist system is finished, but the system that put in place is not that different from the, in fact, of either the Soviet system or the Tsarist system of the 19th century, which of course ended with the Russian Revolution of 1917. So that's the normal, but at the same time, the desire of people for freedom is also cannot be extinguished. So it keeps coming up, and the question is, can you develop the institutions that will preserve it or not?
Great, thank you. And the time it's almost there, but if it's okay with the organizer, we'll take a few more minutes so we have a number of questions from the floor. We'll go to the left here, to the woman. Can you introduce yourself?
Sorry. I just want to...
Take the microphone. Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Fleur Romein. I'm working in Hungary now. And this is not really my topic, but I've studied development studies, so I know some part of it. I just had a quick comment about the governments, for example, who, for example, the government of Nigeria. And when you look at how they are treating, and for example, the funds, and also the bribes which come from the oil companies and which go into the government, how do you look at that when you look at, for example, keeping them accountable to civil society?
Okay, we will take two more questions for now, and we'll come back to the panel. Let's go to the other.
I just want to ask to know your opinion about Kazakhstan in general and how situation in Ukraine affects to Central Asia. Thank you.
And we'll go here to the front.
Thank you. Talking about the corruption in the sector, in the mining sector. That's why I would ask all of you about Guinea. Guinea is in the West Africa, Guinea-Conakry. Today we are fighting against the several companies who have a right in our large mountain who called Simano. What is your advice? Because we have to transforming this iron ore in the money and in the social infrastructure. What is your advice?
You want to start?
Well, let me start with Guinea, because that's a country that I am very deeply involved, actually helping Alpha Condé to regain a title to Simandou. If it's accomplished, it will be a tremendous breakthrough because it will be the first time that actually this has been accomplished. Now, at the same time, the political situation in Guinea is also very precarious because the people they've had Alpha Condé in power now for I think probably more than 2 years, probably 3 years, and they haven't seen any benefit. He has been extremely courageous. I mean, genuinely, I don't agree with all his ideas, and I'll mention some, but I do admire him for his personal courage, because there was actually an assassination attempt that very nearly succeeded. Not many people, not many rulers or presidents take that kind of risk. It's a success story in the making. But at the same time, coming back to the earlier discussion, Alpha Condé has some ideas, like he believes in having a 20% share in the companies that exploit the minerals, and I think that's a very bad way to get paid, because you never get paid, because there's always something that you can you depend on the mining company to pay dividends, and you may not get paid for 10 years or longer. So I've been arguing with him that that's not the best way, and in fact, it's very, and this comes back to the earlier discussions with Paul, that the main problem is that it takes a long time to realize the values that are in the ground, because you have to develop the mine, you have to repay the cost of development, etc. And we are now working, this is sort of the natural governance to actually be able to borrow on the future revenues, so that people can get some benefit now from the wealth that will only produce income in the years to come. It's the obverse of an oil fund or a sovereign wealth fund. It's a sovereign wealth borrowing facility.
It's a sovereign debt fund.
Well, a debt fund. And I think if one could put that together, that would help to bridge this gap, which can be extremely long before you can actually realize wealth out of the resources that you have got hold of.
Quick comment, Paul and Bob.
Just to follow up on Guinea and Simandou, Guinea needs foreign companies, but the resource companies that are out there are a very wide spectrum. Some have got a lot of skills and a lot of transparency. and some are basically run by crooks. And so in more than any other industry, it's really important who you get. And that has been the challenge in Guinea. Guinea also illustrates this problem of managing expectations. President Condé came in to inherit a ruin, a wreck of a country. The previous regime had plundered the country to the point where it was on the brink of macroeconomic crisis. It had no relations with either the IMF or the World Bank. It was in arrears. This was a disaster. And it took the first 2 years to pull back from that disaster, to stabilize the country. Good relations have been restored. Aid started to flow. So there have been achievements, but the population needs really educating in where did this regime start? And so realistic expectations were actually benchmarked on realism. What the government of Guinea has achieved is remarkable. They inherited a crisis, they're over the crisis, they're now into the growth phase, and they've sorted out this pigsty of inherited natural resource contracts, which is a vital matter. Let me also turn to Nigeria, and there was one integrating comment on both Guinea and Nigeria, which is the irreducible need for courage in the reform process. And this goes back to what Mr. Soros said about the brave people who just ran against armed police in the Ukraine. There is an irreducible need for courage. And having said that, I'm really glad that I'm in a country where I don't have to show any. But a lot of you are in countries where courage is an inescapable ingredient of change. And we see that in Nigeria, because that was as Mr. Soros said, we've seen it in Guinea, a president who had the courage to take big risks. Right? A very senior official in the Treasury in Guinea was gunned down, was murdered just about 12 months ago. So there's a real risk here. In Nigeria, the governor of the central bank, Governor Sanusi, recently stood up. He'd collected a lot of evidence about allegations of criminality, and he went public with it. And that was a brave thing to do. The presidential response was not necessarily even shrewd, because even if you were guilty, a shrewd response would have been to say, we're going to take this very seriously, we'll set up a commission which will report in sometime in the 2020s. But instead, the president stood up and sacked the governor, which is about as close to a public admission of guilt as you can contrive, really. So courage and brave people do make a difference. Sanusi will, I predict, make a big difference in Nigeria, because the stuff's out of the can now.
Two brief comments. One about corruption. Of course, when you say corruption, you immediately think of the tax system. And the question about many of these countries in corruption revolves around side payments to either tax administrators, other government officials, as a way of avoiding tax and as a way of getting around the system. what I have found is that complexity enhances corruption. The more opaque the rules, the more complex the tax system, the more complex the regulatory system, the easier it is to begin to get involved in side payments. So I've come to the conclusion that in many situations that what we need is not the perfect answer, we need an answer. And we need clear, and in many cases, clearly arbitrary rules to say, this is the way we're going to do it. It's not right. Sometimes we'll win, sometimes we'll lose, but we have to figure out a way to get started to simplify the system in a way that everybody knows the rules, and because once everybody knows the rules and there are these clear rules, there's no room for bargaining. And that the incentive for bargaining at least is reduced. With respect to Guinea, where these two gentlemen have now gotten me involved in some highly technical discussions about the structure of the particular contract in Guinea. My comment has to do with this negative or the negative wealth fund, where the revenues, the future revenues are used to fund debt today. When you, the first thing two comments. The first thing is that nobody's going to loan Guinea money if there's no assurance that there's not going to be a flow at the end. And at this point, it's not clear. It's not clear, and so there needs to be some transparency with respect to the nature of how these contracts are going to evolve. That's the bad news, but the good news is that if you can leverage one of these funds, what can potentially happen to use the borrowing is that now, in addition to civil society and the local population, you have a group of self-interested financial people who are asking the government, where's the money? Where's the money? We are going to now monitor you to make sure that you get your tax administration up to some minimum standard. And we, the international financial community, may in fact have a self-interest in making an investment in your administrative capacity to begin to increase the domestic administrative capacity in a way that will benefit not only this one particular mining project, but the overall administrative capacity of the government.
I know that there are so many who want to continue asking questions. I've been getting signals that we are well overdue in terms of time. Some of the discussion will continue thereafter that. For the sake of time also, I will not even try to summarize the extremely rich discussion, but if you allow me to take the liberty in my capacity of the provocateur, to point out that there are many also Twitter questions that come in that we cannot fully address. But there's one that just came in that I feel that I will say something in putting this a little bit together before we end up, because it's very personal in some sense, although the Twitterer may not even know that. And the Twitterer, whether it's he or she, asks, how come Chile has done it? How did Chile do it? And I'm full disclosure from Chile. I'm not going to spend 15 minutes in saying that that's a different panel, but it is true that Chile has done it. And I'll tell just one very, very quick story. It's 1989. The dictator in power, Mr. Pinochet, is so confident that he can stay for 10 more years that he says, I'm not going to have elections, but I'm going to have a plebiscite. The economy is growing again. He knows he can also fiddle with the votes, and in fact it was arranged that he would fiddle. So he arranges for a plebiscite, yes or no, for 10 more years. A group of brave people, and that's bravery, gets organized with the most sophisticated statistical IT tools in underground computers the government doesn't know, to get an immediate estimate, basically prediction of what the vote would be, not on exit polls, because there have not been any polls for so long, but based on the first set of tables that vote. So already by 9 p.m., they come out with the prediction that was going to be 52 to 48, more or less. It came, and it was exactly that at the end of the vote, so Pinochet had no choice, and he had to step down. The next day, the only irreverent newspaper said, the old fart ran alone and came in second. But why do I tell that story? Because at the end of the day, I think a very simple but summary answer to the question, how did Chile do it, is a combination of what we have been discussing here. It's, on the one hand, the leadership, accountability, voice, civil society, which is absolutely critical, and the technical and the policy issues. In 1999, when Pinochet leaves power, the democratic government comes in, excellent new leadership, but by the time Pinochet comes into power, virtually half of the population, like 47%, is under the poverty line. Today, it's less than 15, 1/5. So it's a real concrete example of what we have done also research for the impact of governance, including natural resources around the world, and we call it the 300% development dividend of good governance. It does pay off, but it requires the combination of both. At the end of the day, we keep saying, we are very upset when people tell us, oh, the Chilean miracle. No, it was not an act of God. It was not a miracle. It was people, it was courage, it was accountability side, together with technical aspect, how people trained themselves, went abroad, sought the best possible advice, and it's that synergy and combination that has done it. Of course, it's much more about the mining sector and the story of a successful state-owned enterprise, which is Codelco, alongside the private sector. So there are many very rich stories, but I think it's really important to recognize that. But let me also end by saying that we in Latin America, and I cannot speak for all of them, but I know that resonates a lot in Latin America, we have very little tolerance for the restrictive space for civil society, dictators, and so on, because we have gone through a lot. So we are very vocal in that context, both for moral grounds, but also at the end of the day, disclosure, all what we're talking about here, disclosure and transparency, if it's not converted into real accountability and good policy making, it will not deliver the goods. So you need both sides of the equation. At least that's what comes out from the Chilean example. But let me finish here. I couldn't help giving that Twitter in making that comment and that contribution of that. But most important, I think we owe a great round of applause to the great three panelists that we have been with us.